Alright guys, as promised, the windmill tutorial. Sorry for the delay on it. As I always tell you guys, life happens. But anyway, I got my cheat sheet here so I don't get too far off subject and ramble on. But what we're going to cover in this video is the form work, the big mistakes people make when doing them that commonly lead to injury and make them to where they don't want to do them. The progressions going from not being able to do a windmill to being able to do whatever advanced variation you want to do, and obviously the variations from least demanding to most demanding to give you that variety to force more adaptations that we're going for in both performance as well as aesthetics. So first things first, what does the windmill really help you do? It really improves core strength and stability in and around the shoulder girdle. So that said, it's also going to improve your overall mobility, and like any other exercise that improves mobility, it's also going to test that mobility. So before doing any of this, I need to stress to you the importance of doing a solid dynamic warm-up that emphasizes shoulder, thoracic spine, and hip mobility, as well as a little bit of, ankle mobility is, at the bottom too. But nevertheless, make sure before you take any of this wisdom to implement a good dynamic warm-up that emphasizes mobility in those areas. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to move freely and you're going to put yourself at risk for injury. All right, guys, so let's start with the 3 cues that I'm going to give you ad nauseum with pretty much every single exercise you do with a kettlebell. That's keep your core tight, your shoulders packed, and your joints stacked. What I mean by that is your core being tight, you want to brace hard. So instead of sucking in, you want to push out to create that intra-abdominal pressure, all right? On top of that, you want to keep your scapula, your shoulder blades, depressed, pulled down to help stabilize your shoulder, all right? All right, so that helps activate your lats, which co-contracting with your core stabilize your spine all the way up into that shoulder girdle. And when on top of that, you keep your joints stacked one on top of the other, which we're keeping the weight overhead in the windmill. So wrist on top of elbow, elbow on top of shoulder, shoulder on top of hip, knee, and ankle. All of that combines for a more powerful, pain-free lift. So our 3 cues: core tight, shoulders packed, joint stacked. We're going to mine those cues through the entirety of the windmill movement, making sure that as we move through it, we're making sure that our joints remain stacked, our core remains tight to prevent any lateral flexion while our trunk rotates, getting to the bottom, and while we hinge back and move all the way back up. So core tight, shoulders packed, joint stacked. Keep that in mind throughout the entirety of the movement. Now let's get to the movement itself. We're going to clean and press up, so drive through your hips, punch through, press up. From here, everything's in position. We're a nice tight column. We're then, if we're loading the weight on our right side, we're going to shift our feet 45 degrees away from the side that the weight is loaded on. From here, we're going to, eyes on top of the kettle, or eyes on the kettlebell at all times as well. That's one of the cues that I love that keeps me from kind of swaying. We're going to keep eyes on the kettlebell, and our first move is to hinge our hips back, because the windmill itself is a hinge, all right? We're not bending forward, we're hinging our hips back to lower and rotate our spine while we get to the bottom. And if you notice, what I'm trying to do is hinge, 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 and trying to keep this arm that's overhead as perpendicular to the ground as possible, while preventing, and I'm rotating my torso here, but I'm preventing any lateral flexion. So nothing collapsing, staying nice and tight, and then driving back up. The whole time, keeping my eyes on that kettlebell. So again, core tight, shoulders packed, joints stacked. Start from the ground position, press, shift, 45 degrees, eyes on the kettlebell at all times. Keep it perpendicular with the ground. I'm going to hinge my hips back. Keep this arm as perpendicular as possible, core tight, preventing lateral flexion. Drive back up. right there. All right, so remember, biggest, most important thing, while minding your cues of core tight, shoulders packed, joints stacked, we hinge our hips back to lower while rotating our torso, our trunk. We want to make sure that we're not allowing any lateral flexion. All right, so now let's talk about the different form progressions you need to go through in order to go from not being able to do a windmill or not feeling comfortable doing a windmill to being able to achieve whichever variation you want to do, no matter how complex or advanced it might be. First things first, you need to nail down the movement. So you don't even really need a kettlebell, all right? First, you have to, like I said, go through your dynamic warm-up to make sure your mobility is there in the thoracic spine, your shoulders, your hips, as well as your ankles. But say you've done that, the first thing we want to do is get you comfortable with the movement pattern itself. And for that, you don't need any weight, nor should you have any, especially if you're a beginner. So what you want to do is just go with the movement as if you do have a weight in your hand, you've got it loaded, and just work through this. So if this is the imaginary loaded hand, we want to get in position, okay? So overhead, core tight, shoulders packed, joints stacked on top of each other. We have our ankles shifted 45 degrees. Our eyes are on our hands. I like to keep it extended because it adds a little bit of tension, all right? So from here, we're going to hinge our hip back, try to keep this arm as perpendicular as possible, reach, and once you get to your limitation in your mobility that prevents you from keeping that stable spine position, that's when we stop. So if you don't have the mobility to get beyond this point without having something collapse or something's just too tight, then that's where you stop. So first things first, your first progression is to master the movement without load. Once you get comfortable with that, then we're going to move into the low windmill. That's going to be pretty much the same thing, but instead of having the weight overhead, we're going to have the weight on the ground. So we're going to act as if we're doing the first progression with no weight at all, but then we're going to reach down, and it's almost like a suitcase deadlift in conjunction with the windmill, okay? So that will give you some load, forcing you to stay nice and tight to prevent any lateral flexion while getting through the windmill movement itself. Once you're more comfortable with that, once you have improved mobility in your shoulders, your thoracic spine, your hips, your ankles, then you can slowly work up to adding a little bit of weight with the traditional single kettlebell overhead windmill position. So after those, you can then slowly work into a loaded windmill, all right? Another point I want to make with these, this has to do with the execution. You don't want to rush them, right? So you want to make sure you're going not necessarily slow, but methodical and purposeful with your movement, all right? This is not a very ballistic, dynamic movement that has you moving the weight fast. You want to be in control of this. So don't try to speed this up in any way. Be slow, methodical, and controlled in this movement, because it does put you in precarious positions if you're not being mindful of what's going on with that weight overhead. So again, just to recap, the progressions go from no weight, just mastering the movement, all right, to the low windmill, and then work your way up to the regular windmill. Now, let's move into the different variations that I like to do to kind of spice things up. All right, so I'm not gonna talk about any of your form cues. All the cues that I discussed up to this point apply to each one of these different variations. Whenever you're capable of doing any of these variations, move up as soon as you can to the more advanced ones, just to kind of spice things up and to constantly test yourself. Now, with that being said, we're gonna move from least demanding to most demanding in this flow of different variations. I'll do 1 or 2 reps just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. So the easiest is obviously going to be your low windmill. So again, right here, reach. That's going to be your easiest. From there, we're going to move into the high windmill. Shift feet. Again, moving to the limitations of our core strength, stability, as well as mobility. After the high windmill, we're going to do a seated windmill and then move into our double windmill variations. So this will definitely test your mobility more. So we're going to press and Alright, now let's move into our double kettlebell variations. First one's going to be what's called a high-low. Do this. Start with 1 kettlebell in the high position. Shift your feet, hinge back, let peek down. Alright. Hinge. Alright, obviously whatever you do for one side, switch it up and do the other. Next is going to be an iso rack windmill. So press up, shift, always going to shift away from the side with the weight overhead. Try to keep it as stacked as possible, perpendicular. These are tough. Yeah, like see, I lost a little core tension there, and that's what happens. Eyes on it. All right, and the last, and the one that I find most demanding, is going to be a half kneeling windmill. All right, so from here, we have kneeling position. Instead of having your back leg pointed straight out, we're going to tilt it in just a little bit to accommodate your ability to rotate and get in position. So if this leg is forward, that means this arm is going to be the loaded arm. So press, keep it stacked, hinge back, and again, once you reach the point where you can no longer, based on your mobility, achieve that neutral spine position that prevents any lateral flexion while your torso or your trunk rotates to get to the bottom, that's when you stop the movement and go back up. At the end of the day, windmills, all different variations, fantastic way to develop killer core strength, stabilizing strength in the shoulder girdle, as well as mobility. You must learn to do them correctly in order to get the most from them and also to prevent any injury though. So, sorry if I rambled on at all. Sorry for how long it took you to get this. But overall, if you have any questions for me regarding the windmill, leave them down in the comment section and I'll be sure to hit you up with a quick response. Hands up, keep fighting.